On a remote corner of the Alaska Peninsula, brown bears at Brooks River in Katmai National Park are making their final preparations for winter hibernation, and they're seeking the last of summer salmon. At nearly the same latitude, only more than 2,000 miles east, polar bears wait on the shore of Hudson Bay for the return of sea ice. Unlike the brown bears, who are at their fattest point of the year, polar bears are at their skinniest. As winter descends upon North America, we witness a tale of two ecosystems and the bears that call these places home. While the brown bear cam season is near its end, polar bear cam season on Explore.org has just begun. What we see on these cams offers stark contrasts in the lifestyles and adaptations of two closely related bear species. It also serves as a poignant reminder of the impact humans have on these animals. Hi, everyone. This is Mike Fitz, your resident naturalist with Explore.org. We're excited to partner once again with Polar Bears International to bring you live footage of the polar bears along the shore of Hudson Bay near Churchill, Manitoba, to explore the world of polar bears and how their biology and lifestyle differs and contrasts with brown bears. I'm joined by BJ Kirschhoffer, Director of Field Operations for Polar Bears International. He's also a webcam guru and a polar bear expert in his own right. And I'm excited to have the opportunity to talk to him today. So BJ, thanks for joining me.
Hey, thanks for having me today, Mike, and it's a pleasure to be on. And I think this is going to be a fun topic, comparing and contrasting the polar bear against the grizzly bear or the Alaskan brown bear. It's going to be fun.
Absolutely. These two species are very closely related, but they're so different in many ways. And I think we're going to have a fun time exploring the similarities and differences. Maybe before we get into the nuts and bolts of that, though, can you tell us just a little bit more about Polar Bears International and its mission?
Sure. So we're a small nonprofit based in Canada and the United States. We've got boots on the ground efforts in many of the polar bear nations, and most excitingly, this time of year, it is polar bear season in Churchill, Manitoba. And like Mike has explained, we have the Explore camps streaming to you live from the shores of Hudson Bay, showing the polar bears as they wait for the sea ice to freeze to the north of where they are right now. So this is a view right now from Cape Churchill inside Wapuss National Park, outside of Churchill, Manitoba. This is about 40 kilometers or so outside of town. There's no roads to this location here. The cameras are mounted on this old research tower put up by Dr. Ian Sterling, a famous polar bear biologist. And he put up the tower to watch polar bears. Now you can do the same from his vantage point using the Explore cam. So yeah, like I say, we're a small nonprofit, and our mission really is to conserve polar bears and the sea ice they depend on. You know, the main takeaway here is that polar bears need sea ice to live. That this is their access to their food, and I think we'll get into that a little bit later. But you know, without sea ice, polar bears cannot catch seals, and without sea ice, you don't get the big polar bear that you are, or that you see here. They need that marine mammal fat in order to get to the big size that they are. So we'll get into that a little bit later as we kind of talk about the calories and the food differences between the two animals. But yeah, it's great to be with you today.
And if you have questions about brown or polar bears for BJ or myself, you can drop them those questions into the chat below the live camera feed. Just scroll down below the thumbnails for the other cameras and you'll see the chat there. We have a wonderful moderator who volunteers for Explore.org that will be sending some of those questions your way. And we'll try to get to a few of those at the end of the chat. BJ, I think it's important, to introduce, I think maybe some of the contrast in the locations of the brown bears that we watch on Explore.org versus the polar bears. The brown bear location that I'm familiar with is, of course, Katmai National Park in Alaska. It's on the northern Alaska Peninsula when we were watching the brown bear cams there. We are looking at a place that's about 300 miles southwest of Anchorage, Alaska, and it's tucked sort of in between the Bering Sea and the North Pacific Ocean. So while it gets cold in Katmai, it doesn't get nearly as cold as what it does in more Arctic environments because of the moderating effects of the oceans and the open water. The habitat there is a lot of shrub thickets and trees at low elevations interspersed with large lakes and pristine rivers. There's also a chain of volcanoes that runs down the spine of Katmai National Park. And Katmai has probably more brown bears living in it than all the grizzlies that are estimated to live in the contiguous 48 states right now. So it's a very rich environment, particularly because Katmai supports very healthy runs of salmon right now. So but interestingly enough, BJ, the environment of Katmai is nearly the same latitude as Churchill, Manitoba, but where polar bears are living in Churchill, it's a very different place compared to Katmai.
That's exactly right. Churchill is at about 58 degrees north latitude. It's some of the most southerly of polar bears, but it's not the most southerly that you'll find polar bears. If KT can bring up the map again, there's a little bit of a lobe. If you look to the southeast of Churchill, and you're kind of seeing it come into view there. There's that lobe that comes down so far south to the bottom of your screen there. That's called James Bay. And that is the most south you will find polar bears on the planet. This kind of environment really would be maybe something that you almost would see maybe in Maine, probably fairly similar, kind of a swampy, boggy environment with small trees. You got some bigger trees in Maine there, but some small trees. It really is kind of a forested ecosystem back away from the bay, and then as you get close to the bay, it turns into more mudflat terrain, and then really kind of this extension of the Arctic Ocean, this big body of water. The temperatures in the Hudson Bay region vary wildly. And I think that's one thing that's probably one of the big differences between these two places, where you're moderated by a constant, melted ocean, if you will, an ocean that most people think about would be just water. The Hudson Bay freezes solid, or near solid, every winter. And when that happens, the place becomes incredibly cold. The entire environment there can plunge to very, very cold temperatures, minus 30, minus 40 Fahrenheit quite easily. So, but again, when summertime comes and all that ice melts on Hudson Bay, the place can warm up, and it can be quite warm. I mean, it could be shorts and t-shirt weather on the odd day in the Hudson Bay area.
So the habitats are extremely different, but brown and polar bears are closely related. They really do also display considerable differences in appearance, diet, as well. So let's, I think, take a few moments to discuss what defines these two bear species. In appearance might be maybe the most obvious. Brown bear fur, can range anywhere from blonde to dark brown, and while it provides some camouflage, the fur really isn't specialized for its habitat. How does polar bear fur differ?
Yeah, so I actually have a swatch of polar bear fur here, and this is what you will see, of course, if you see a polar bear wandering around on the cams here. It is, to appearance, almost white in some lights, but also can be almost a yellowish color depending on what the lighting conditions are. So as you're looking at the cams and you're looking across the landscape there, if you see something that almost like a limestone yellow, that could very well be a polar bear. So yeah, so they're pretty well camouflaged for their environment. A white fur is helpful. You wouldn't, I don't think, want to be a brown bear wandering around the sea ice trying to sneak up on things to eat them. I think you're going to be spotted more easily. You look at the other predators up there, and they're also typically got some light fur. So this is their camouflage. It also helps them stay warm, as I mentioned. The temperatures can be super cold for most of where polar bears live, depending on the time of year. So the fur helps them stay warm in those frigid temperatures.
They also have From what I've seen with, we'll talk more about claws in a little bit, but yeah, the paws of polar bears. When I was in Churchill a few years ago, that was one of the things that really stood out to me, was not only how big they are, but also how well furred they are. The paws of brown bears don't nearly have as much fur to them. So that, I think, is just another tremendous adaptation that they have to very cold climates. Another way that these bears differ considerably, though, is in their diet. Brown bears, when we're watching them in Katmai, we're watching them on the bear cams, we're seeing them eat literally tons of salmon each year. But brown bears as a species are generalist omnivores. So they subsist on a wide variety of foods. They in most habitats outside of like coastal Alaska and British Columbia, they're subsisting largely on plants. Where you are right now, BJ, in Bozeman, so the grizzly bears in Montana, for instance, especially in that northern continental divide ecosystem, are largely vegetarian. They'll supplement their diet with meat when they can get it, but something around 75% or 90% of their assimilated diet comes from plants each year. So brown bears can eat a wide variety of foods. Polar bears have the ability to eat a variety of foods as well, but they're much more specialized for their habitats. What is the main food source for polar bears?
Yeah, I think it's good to remember that polar bears are bears and they will eat anything. I mean, we've got some great collar cam footage. This was a researcher, Anthony Pagano, that put a GoPro-like device on a polar bear and turned it loose into the wild to see what it does. And here's some great footage. This is a polar bear in some of those southern parts of its habitat, eating berries, wandering around in the forest. So just like maybe grizzly bears or black bears would do, these bears will eat anything they can get their hands on. But you do not get these large animals eating berries and grubs and ants and things like that. You really need what the polar bear's favorite food is, and that's marine mammals and primarily the ring seal. They will also eat bearded seals, narwhal, whatever else they can get their paws on. If a whale washes up, they will happily eat it. But they really need about an average of one ring seal per week for the entire year in order to survive. There's a neat shot there of a seal waiting at a breathing hole, and so this is where the polar bear is going to hunt. It's going to be waiting at the breathing holes or try to sneak up on seals as they take a breath, or try to crash into their lairs when they're having their pups in the springtime. So just like the bears in Katmai, where they gorge themselves on salmon, polar bears kind of do the same thing in the springtime when the pupping season happens for the ring seals. They can go out on the ice and search out these birth layers, smash into these birth layers, and find a baby seal in there to suck down.
And compared to other carnivores like wolves and lynx, brown bears have a slightly elongated digestive tract, and that is probably an adaptation to just provide a bit more surface area within their intestines to absorb energy from and digest plant matter. I'm wondering, though, has the polar bear digestive tract adapted in any specific way to help those bears digest their meat-heavy diet? Is it more strictly along those carnivore lines?
That's a good question. I actually don't know the answer to that, but they do have some pretty interesting adaptations. Earlier, as far as digestion is concerned, earlier I said that polar bears need on average one seal per week, but that doesn't mean, every Monday they're getting a seal. That's not how it works in the polar bear world, especially as you're looking at those bears out on the cams right now. They potentially haven't eaten anything of much substance since they returned from the sea ice sometime in late spring, early summer. So you can almost think of a battery or a polar bear's system almost like a battery. Your iPhone or whatever kind of phone you have, device you may have that runs on a charge. Kind of polar bears are the same way. They wander around in the good seasons, hopefully catching as many seals as they can, kind of recharging their battery, getting fatter and fatter. And then they can use those fat stores to sustain themselves for months and months during the lean times, like the bears are in Churchill right now. In fact, some of the most extreme examples of this is a really fat bear that you're seeing here. I don't think it's quite as
That's a
big
good
as
look.
747 was there, but that is a good
Good
looking
looking
polar
bear
bear.
though.
That is a healthy bear. Now this bear could coast for quite a while using those fat stores. The pregnant females, I don't know if we're going to talk about, maybe we will talk about denning. So maybe I won't give away this hint yet, but the females, stay tuned, because we'll talk about just how amazing they are and how long they can go without eating. Yeah, it's pretty incredible.
Yeah, we'll definitely get to denning and hibernation and some of those differences in just a few more moments. I did want to ask you one more thing though about maybe the specialized morphology of polar bears versus brown bears. When we look at their teeth, for instance, brown bears have impressively large canine teeth. They definitely have premolars that are good for handling meat when they end up eating it. But brown bears also have slightly flattened molars to help them chew vegetation. How does that contrast with the molars of a polar bear, for instance?
Well, I just so happen to have a replica skull here of a polar bear. So this is our bone clone, if you will. So this is the polar bear's teeth, and if you look at it, these canines, these front teeth, are really the teeth of of a seal killing machine. And if you look here, there's this big space here, and I'm going to see if I can look through it there. There we go. That big space there, that's called the diastema. And that space between the front canines and the back teeth there allow these front teeth to truly sink in super deep into the flesh of the animal that it's trying to grab. It's kind of gross, I know. It's the way it is out there in the wild. So these teeth, they can just jam through the snow, like I said, through the birthing layer, and pull out those baby seals, or if they're lucky enough to catch something at a breathing hole. That's really what these teeth, and even this elongated skull and neck, when you look at um, images of polar bear, I don't know if KT can pull one up, just kind of the entire head structure is really designed almost like a skinny torpedo or something, for reaching down breathing holes, for reaching into snow holes and grabbing out whatever may be occupying below.
That's the skull shape phenomenon, or consistency of skull shape, maybe is a more accurate way of saying it, in polar bears is fascinating to me, because when we watch the brown bear cams, we see a wide variety in head shapes, uh, and it's not just size, right? Like male bears might have bigger skulls than female bears, but also in like the shape of their face. Some of them do have more tapered snouts like a polar bear, but some have that more classic dinner plate wide face with a sort of a projecting muzzle from it. But it really does look like polar bears have a more consistent skull shape, and perhaps that's an adaptation that allows them to stick their heads in those icy holes and pull out their preferred prey. That's something that I've been wondering about for a while. I don't know if you have any insights on that, or can maybe agree or disagree with that, with my idea
No,
there.
I think no, I do think you're right. I do think there's a lot of uniformity between the animals, between the polar bears. It really doesn't matter where you are. I think this is a question we get a lot. Can you tell a Norwegian polar bear from a Canadian polar bear? And other than their accent, no, you cannot. No, just kidding. There's really no difference. They're all about the same. So yeah, I just don't think there is a ton of variation there. Maybe, yeah. I think between the sexes, of course, there are. The males can be quite a bit bigger than the females, and you can see here these are two males that had just sparred. I know this because I've seen the clip a few times, but these two guys are pretty darn big, and there are some other kind of telltale signs that help you tell what the differences are too. But really, yeah, I think heads are relatively about the same size as well as the males. Just the males are really big and the females are slightly smaller.
And one way that brown bears make a living is that, like I mentioned before, they're generalist omnivores. They'll eat a wide variety of foods. They also live in a wide variety of habitats. I mean, you can find brown bears from temperate Europe all the way throughout much of northern Asia, especially sometimes in the central Asia, and then into North America from the Arctic slope, down historically all the way down into Mexico. And one way that brown bears are well adapted to a wide range of environments is through their claws, their front claws in particular. They're like buckets on an excavator. Here's a great example of that. This is some brown bear feet from a brown bear on the coast of the Pacific side of Katmai National Park. So they can be 4 or 5 inches long and really well adapted for digging. If you're thinking about, a bear living as a largely vegetarian bear, pulling out roots from the ground, tubers from the ground, sometimes mushrooms like truffles, for instance, can be an important part of their diet in certain habitats. So their claws are extremely well adapted to digging for plant foods under the earth. Now, polar bear claws are quite a bit different. BJ, can you talk a little bit more about how polar bear claws differ and how that's a specialization for their lifestyle?
Yeah, actually, I wish I had a replica grizzly bear claw. This is a little off focus, sorry, folks. But this is a replica polar bear claw. A side-by-side comparison is pretty amazing because, as you described there, Mike, the grizzly bear claws, the brown bear claws are huge. They are massive, and these ones here are quite short. They're pretty thick, but the one difference you'll notice, they are very, very sharp. And again, it kind of goes in along with the teeth that we were talking about earlier. If you have a food source that is quite slippery and can get away easily, you want sharp things in order to dig into them so they don't get away. So this is part of that as well. Of course, their food isn't the only thing that's slippery in their environment. Just the substrate they're walking on most of the year, the ice, is also slippery. So I imagine this would help give them purchase. Another thing we kind of missed earlier when you were talking about their paws themselves, yeah, their paws are huge, furred to help keep them warm, but they also have almost like little suction cups on the bottom too. They're called papillae, and these help them gain traction also on their environment. They are really an animal that is well adapted for the sea ice. When you watch them move around in this environment, and hopefully as the sea ice freezes here, we'll get to see some of that on the cams. They really are incredibly kind of dexterous in this environment as they move around. It's pretty amazing to watch.
They're so comfortable on the ice. It is really amazing to see them navigate that terrain. Brown and polar bears, though, have some pretty specialized adaptations to surviving seasons of the year where there's not, a lot of food for them to eat. And BJ, you touched on that just a little bit with polar bears. I want to kind of talk about brown bears for just a little bit and set up, the idea or the phenomenon of hibernation in these animals before we get back to how that is applicable to polar bears, because brown bear hibernation and just bear hibernation in general is maybe one of the most fascinating things that mammals have ever evolved. It's maybe the most specialized form of hibernation, and it's really the event that brown bears have spent months preparing for. We have, I think, a photo of Fat Bear Week Champ 747 that we can bring up, but this is also a bear den in Katmai National Park. But 747 this year at Brooks River, he came back fat and he just kept getting fatter. And that's all really in preparation for hibernation and the springtime season when he comes out of the den and there's not a lot of food for him to eat. When he's inside of the den, he won't eat, he won't drink. He also won't urinate or defecate. So he's subsisting solely on his fat reserves during that time. He's using those fat reserves to not only stay warm and provide his body with the body heat he needs, but also to stay hydrated as well. So it's an amazing feat that that he's able to do throughout the winter. If you put a human in the same situation, a human would not survive. Even if we had the fat reserves to essentially survive months of starvation, our bodies would do very poorly without exercise. If we're immobilized for long periods of time, we lose muscle mass and bone mass very easily. It's very hard for us to recoup that once we become active once again. But brown bears don't have those issues. They seem to have evolved adaptations to solve those problems. So brown bear hibernation is a fascinating topic. But polar bear hibernation, BJ, is also extremely fascinating in its own right. In any given year, most polar bears aren't entering the den, though. Which polar bears utilize dens, and why are they doing that?
Yeah, I think the good thing to remember here with polar bears when we talk about hibernation, most other bears, they enter the den because of food scarcity, right? You got these animals that are in the landscape looking for something to eat. When that food disappears, well, it's more efficient for them to go into the den and hide out and wait till the food returns than it is to try to eke a living out. So polar bears actually, if you think about kind of in the calendar year at the same time in the north, just as brown bears are entering the den, polar bears are just getting out on the sea ice to really start making their living. That's when they're going to get their food for the year. So, so there isn't any incentive to go to sleep, even though it's dark out, even though it's cold out. Doesn't matter. This is the time to eat, so they're not going to go into the den. The exception to that is the pregnant females, and this is a pretty special little thing I mentioned earlier. Pregnant females can go in some cases up to 8 months if they're well prepared. That means if they've caught enough seals in the off or during the hunting season, during the winter and spring. If they're fat enough, if they look about like 747 there, then potentially they could, if they've made it, go into a den. Here's inside of a den looking out in the Churchill region. They could potentially go into the den and give birth to cubs and come out. They're not going into the den though, to kind of go to sleep. They're going into the den because it's protected. It's a safe place where they can give birth to these cubs. So just to review, it's only the pregnant females that are going to go into the den. And another interesting thing is their cubs are super small. They're born at about a pound, somewhere around the first of the year. Here's some cubs after they've come out of the den. Still quite delicate, but that den is so important because it's more or less like an extension of the womb. These cubs are so small, born at a pound, that if mom were to take them outside or something were to happen to their den, it's far too cold outside for them to survive. So they have to stay in that den for a couple of months, sometimes mid-March, sometimes mid-April. And when they're about the size you're seeing there, those are, cubs that probably weigh about 20 pounds or so. That's when they can come out. Another amazing thing, this is totally crazy. Imagine seeing an animal go from 1 pound to 20 pounds in a matter of 8 to 12 weeks. I mean, it is crazy how fast these little buggers grow. And that's just what they're doing. They are in there, safe in the den with mom, nursing on her milk, and just cruising, just growing until they can leave the den structure. And if you recall from earlier, of course, she potentially hasn't eaten in 8 months at the very most. And so mom is getting pretty hungry. The incentive now is to get those cubs big enough so they can leave the den and head back out on the sea ice so mom can get some seals and rebuild her fat stores.
And that's one, I think, aspect of bear hibernation that both brown bears and polar bears have in common. Brown bears also, the females go to the den to give birth. So around the end of February, or excuse me, the end of January, early February, is when about all brown bears in North America are born. So if you have like a favorite bear cam bear, brown bear cam bear, you want to wish a happy birthday to, do it around January 31st, February 1st, somewhere around Groundhog Day in the United States. So yeah, they're also born about a pound at that and they need many more weeks to grow strong enough before they can leave the den with mother. Interestingly, though, brown bears are not obligate hibernators. When you look across like all of brown or black bears, for instance, brown bears, and black bears don't have to go into a den. And I think polar bears provide such a great example of why that is, because it's like you mentioned, BJ, it's not cold that they're necessarily avoiding; it's the lack of food. It's famine. So brown bears really don't find in northerly climates, especially, enough food to make it worth their while to stay outside of the den in the wintertime. It's uh, it's just like you mentioned. It's like a savings account. Those fat reserves are just to help them get through those times of famine in the winter. And I wonder, since polar bears are descended from brown bears, if that may have helped, allow polar bears that ability to not have to go to a den if they can find enough food, or if they live in a climate that supports it. If that helped polar bears to evolve to exploit feeding opportunities on sea ice, since we know that polar bears are direct descendants of brown bears.
Yeah, I think that must have been part of the key. There must have been a few bears at one point, 800,000 years ago or so, that decided, hey, there's some fat seals out there. This stuff on land doesn't taste as good. Maybe I'll head out in the sea ice and try this out. And there you go. That's how the could have maybe had the polar bear come around. Hard to say, but obviously, like you say, they did figure out to exploit a different food source in a time of year where they maybe should have been in the den, but decided not to.
And one more question that I have for you about polar bears and their physiology and how they survive. When we're thinking about brown bears in the den, they're metabolizing body fat, and one of the byproducts of that is metabolic water. And that the bears use that to help keep them hydrated during the months of time that they spend not drinking any water. In winter, though, polar bears are out on the sea ice. There's not really liquid water available to them. And maybe if there is in the springtime after things start to thaw, a lot of it's salt water. So are polar bears using a similar mechanism to stay hydrated? Are they metabolizing a lot of body fat to do that? Or are they eating snow or ice? Or maybe are they gaining enough water from their prey? I don't know if you have any insights on that.
Yeah, the polar bears definitely utilize metabolic water. I think it's pretty important. You know, the fasting period for your brown bears is when they're in the dens. The polar bears in Churchill now, as they're wandering around the landscape there, they're also in a fasting period. So as they consume that body fat, as they kind of get skinnier, walking around the landscape there, they are producing metabolic water, and so they don't have to drink. If you see a polar bear on the cam drinking water, it's a pretty rare thing. Also on the sea ice, the same mechanism is happening, which is, as you described, quite convenient because there are no drinking fountains on the sea ice. Most of the water that you're going to see out there is going to be salt water because you're sitting on the ocean. There might be some freshwater puddles, but that's also pretty energy intensive to be eating snow or drinking cold water in the Arctic. And it's really about who can conserve the most energy in the animal world. So it's inefficient to be trying to warm up that cold water or that snow in order to use it as water for yourself. So yeah, I mean, pretty interesting stuff there. Polar bears are so interesting and so unique to really kind of make a living out there out on the sea ice. It's absolutely amazing. One thing I did want to ask you though, we had that picture of 747 and then we had a picture of the den. There is no way that 747 was going to fit in that den. That's just my thoughts. What do you think?
No, not in that den in particular. This is one that I found in Katmai several years ago. And I like to use the picture. It's hard to see, but I have a couple of hiking poles that are laying just to the left of the den. And those are about 120 centimeters long. So just to give you a sense of scale on the den entrance itself. 747 is so big that maybe he doesn't necessarily need to retreat to a den. We know that bears in other habitats don't necessarily need to hibernate inside of a den. Like in Pennsylvania, for example, there have been documented cases of black bears just denning on the open ground. And on Kodiak Island, for instance, some male brown bears, not a lot, but a few each year, can be active throughout the winter. But if 747 in Katmai is probably going into a den, but his den will be giant. I mean, he's a 1,400-pound bear at this time of the year. So, I mean, that's a huge cavity. I don't know how he does it, but he does it somehow. He makes a living quite well. So certainly an
You
impressive
better
bear.
have some friends. You better have some friends help him excavate that thing. He needs a lot of space.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think he's like the same volume as a large side-by-side refrigerator or something like that. So
Oh my
just
gosh.
a giant animal overall. We've talked a lot about bear biology, their habitats. BJ, I think we want to maybe spend a few minutes towards the end of our chat, though, talking about bear conservation, especially in regard to polar bears, climate change, and even how climate change can affect brown bears. This year, Arctic sea ice is, once again, well below 20th century averages. This is a trend that we can expect to worsen as the climate continues to warm. In fact, this year, Arctic sea ice reached its, I think, its second lowest on record in September. So how will the sea ice or the loss of sea ice affect polar bears?
Well, it's kind of interesting. I think we're already seeing it. It's not if it's going to happen or when it's going to happen. It's happening now, and we're seeing it in the Churchill population. Not too long ago, there would have been 1,200 bears wandering around Churchill, and now I think the numbers are, boy, I think there's somewhere around 800 or so. So we've had a reduction in population, and this is seen in other well-studied populations too around the world. And what this means, it's a pretty simple math problem. Less sea ice really means it's less days of sea ice. There's less days that the polar bears can go out and go eat, and that's less seals that they're going to find, and so they're not going to be as big, and some of them aren't going to survive. And so you have a reduction in population. Interestingly, the bears in Churchill have been studied some of the longest of any polar bears on the planet, a little over 40 years now. And they have taken meticulous measurements of these bears since they started studying these bears. And that means when they dart them and put them temporarily to sleep on the sea ice as their scientists are doing their work, they're measuring how big they are, how much they weigh, how long they are, as well as a few other things as well, fitting them with radio collars, things like that. But what we've seen is bears are getting smaller, and that means they're not getting as much food, and so they're not growing as big. And so it's just tied to this. With less sea ice, we're going to see less polar bears. Right now, yeah, I mean, I think it's just a simple math problem, like I say.
Yeah, that's an interesting fact that you brought up, that the bears are getting smaller overall. When we look at brown bears, for instance, bears that live largely on plant-based diets are smaller than bears that have more meat in their diet, like the brown bears in Katmai that feed so heavily on salmon. So plant-based diets in brown and grizzly bears are correlated with smaller adult body size. You can't get as big as 747, for instance, or the brown bears in Katmai without a lot of high quality foods. And if you have to work harder to find those foods and you are expending more energy, you're not able to devote as much as that energy as efficiently into growing body mass overall. And that brings back a question, and we sort of touched on this earlier in the broadcast, BJ, but somebody was wondering, if you think that one day, polar bears could adapt to an environment without ice or seals, and survive on alternate food resources.
Yeah, I don't. It's a really interesting question. I think actually, being observant camera watchers of the Churchill region, you have already seen the experiment play out. I mean, polar bears, as we've already discussed, figured out how to make a living on the sea ice and evolved into being polar bears from a brown bear ancestor. If they were to, I don't know if the word is really a word, but de-evolve back into a brown bear or grizzly bear, that bear actually already exists. It's the barren ground grizzly, and this is an animal that wanders the tundra up there, and in Alaska. And actually, we've seen one on the Churchill cams, and this animal is quite small. It's quite scrawny. It's got long claws. It's probably a little bit angry because it's hangry. It doesn't have seals to go after each year and fatten up on. So I think that the answer really is you don't have polar bears if you don't have sea ice and you don't have the fat that the marine mammals provide. You just don't have polar bears. You might have, if we had a couple 100,000 years, maybe 800,000 years to see what would happen. You may end up with something else. But likely, that's, like I say, the experiment has already played out, and that's the barren ground grizzly. Also, the changes that we're seeing in the last 30 or 40 years in the Arctic, they're happening extremely, extremely quickly. The changes are so rapid, and that's, evolution. When you talk about animals evolving and being able to adapt to environments, these are changes that happen over, millions of years. And polar bears, you're asking them to live on land and figure it out in 40 years. That ain't happening.
And we've already seen that happen in the past. At least scientists have been able to determine that polar bears that were isolated from sea ice in the past, those populations weren't able to survive. From what I've been reading about bear evolution and their DNA in different populations in North America, there was a study that came out several years ago about brown bear DNA in Southeast Alaska. And they found that some of those bears in Southeast Alaska have polar bear DNA in them. And what those scientists speculated happened is that they're probably, at the end of the last ice age sometime, there was a population of polar bears that lived on the edge of the sea ice in what is now Southeast Alaska. They became isolated as the sea ice retreated farther north with the climate warming at that time. And they ended up interbreeding with the brown bears. But eventually the immigrating brown bears just overwhelmed that population. The polar bears didn't adapt to this new environment. Really, there are some brown bear genes still floating around in that population, but really it's just brown bears right now. So we can also look to the past and see, yeah, it's probably not something that we can expect to happen with polar bears, since they are so specialized for their icy habitats. And one other,
I think that's really,
ahead,
if I can interrupt you really fast,
yeah.
I think it's important to remember, like, if we had some sort of, like, I don't know, vending machine for polar bears in Southeast Alaska, polar bears could live. There's polar bears in San Diego. There's polar bears in zoo institutions all over the world at southern latitudes. It has nothing to do with their ability to survive in warmer temperatures. It's that their sea ice and their food cannot survive, and so they will not survive in the wild.
Yeah, that's a great point. And it seems like with polar bears, we might see those impacts, those climate change impacts, and play themselves out or be most conspicuous with reproducing females. A study on captive brown bears at Washington State University found that female bears with less than 20% body fat at the time of denning did not give birth. So maybe there's some sort of fat threshold that they have to reach where their body determines unconsciously whether or not they're fit enough to support the birth of cubs and to lactate and provide enough milk before they can leave the den. So we talked about how the lack of sea ice will make it harder for polar bears to make a living. Do you think that will be the case with particularly with mother polar bears and female polar bears? Will it be harder for
Polar
them
bears have the same.
bear cubs?
Yeah, the same mechanism exists in polar bears, and I don't know the exact number of what the body weight is, but at a certain threshold, female polar bears realize that they do not have the resources in order to carry a cub to term and be able to nurse and potentially release it in the wild. I mean, this is it's pretty amazing that they have this kind of internal mechanism to be able to tell that, even if they are fat enough, the survival of a young cub is not assured. Mortality rates are quite high for cubs, so that is something to keep in mind. But for sure, as there's less sea ice, less food, it becomes more challenging um, for females to get pregnant, and then also, of course, raise successful cubs all the way to adulthood so that they can enter the population, and that's really where we will probably see these reductions in population. It's the old bears can probably figure out how to continue making a living. They have been polar bears for their entire lives, and they've gotten quite good at finding seals and eating. But the young ones trying to figure out how to make a living in this world is a lot harder. So.
And brown bears, I should mention, aren't immune to the effects of climate change either. Since they live in a wide variety of habitats, the species overall of brown bears is fairly well positioned to survive these habitat changes, but certain populations will certainly be affected by it greater than others. I can think of perhaps the bears in the Yellowstone region, for instance. Already they're feeling the impacts of climate change due to whitebark pines being devastated by pine bark beetles, which are surviving winters in greater numbers. In Katmai National Park, for instance, we really enjoy watching bears fishing for salmon, but without salmon, we're not going to have bears gathering at Brooks River or really along any stream in appreciable numbers, because there's not going to be a reason for bears to do that. And the population of Katmai would plummet, of the bears in Katmai would plummet without salmon. And salmon are probably not as well adapted to weathering a lot of those really extreme changes that we could expect in the climate going forward. So those are just some other things to keep in mind as we're thinking about these animals and how specialized and how well adapted they are to their environments, but also at the same time how vulnerable they can be to future changes. BJ, we do have I think maybe a few more minutes to stick. Oh, please go ahead.
Oh, no, I was just going to say, I think it isn't just polar bears, and it's not just brown bears. It is an amazing amount of species across the planet that will be affected. And humans aren't removed from that. We are a part of the system. And so I think it would behoove us to take care of this place that we call home.
Absolutely. And I wanted to mention one more thing that you have coming up next week, and that's Polar Bear Week. Do you want to tell us a little bit more about what you have coming up?
Sure. So, of course, the cams are live. They're rolling. So please stay tuned to that. Next week, we've got 3 more webcasts coming up for you in the middle of the week, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday. We're going to do a little Zen Out with Polar Bears, a live chat on Tuesday at noon Central. And we're going to talk about Polar Bear Paws and Claws on the 4th of November at noon Central. And really cool project that we're working on right now, trying to figure out how to attach transmitters to polar bears. This is Burr on Fur, tracking polar bears with technology. That is Thursday, November 5th, noon Central time. So please join us next week. We're going to continue webcasting and talking about the cams.
Excellent. I look forward to watching those broadcasts myself. And BJ, do you have a few minutes to stick around and answer a few viewer questions that came in?
Absolutely.
All right. Great. Yeah, we've had a few queued up for a while now, so I appreciate everyone's patience. If you submitted a question, waiting for these answers. Eagle Girl was wondering, what is the average lifespan of a polar bear versus a brown bear? And I can say the average lifespan of a brown bear is around 20 years of age in the wild or so. They have the potential to live much longer than that. They can live more than 30 years in the wild. That's a really old bear. Like a 30-year-old bear is like a 100-year-old person. So it doesn't happen that often. But I don't know about polar bears. What do you think?
Well, the oldest polar bear known was Debbie in the Winnipeg Zoo. She had a great healthcare plan. and she lived to be 42. That is a very, very
Wow.
old polar bear. In the wild, a polar bear in its mid to late 20s would be an old bear. So it's not an easy living out in the wild.
Yeah, so probably fairly similar, I bet, between brown and polar bears in that regard. Um, and I don't know the answer to this question. This is just a second part of her question, but this is about cubs. How many cubs in a lifetime can a female polar bear have versus a brown bear? And it really just depends on the habitat and with brown bears and how many um, and and how fat they are. If brown bears, for example, and it's probably true of polar bears, reproduce at higher rates and have more cubs, the fatter that they are. So over the course of a female bear's lifetime, she could potentially have something like, 5 to 7 litters, but they usually keep their cubs for 2 to 3 years. So they're very slow to reproduce overall. And I think this is also something that brown and polar bears have in common. What do you think, BJ?
Yeah, I was just doing some quick math here. If a female bear reaches maturity at 5 years old and lives to be 25 years old and has cubs every 3 years and has 2 to 3 cubs, that could be 16 to 24 cubs throughout her lifetime. I hope my math is correct. I don't like doing math on live TV.
Well, there's probably a few hundred fact checkers out there doing that right now. So they'll let us know
Okay,
if it's
let me know.
incorrect. Brian W. was wondering that if a loss of late and early season sea ice is causing a loss of polar bear habitat at this time, are the sows, the female polar bears, producing fewer cubs, like single cubs, for example, versus litters of 2 or 3?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and the answer would be yes. Churchill was a place known for twins and triplets because it was such a productive place. A place where there was a lot of sea ice for a long period of time of the year, and then tons and tons of seals. We're seeing less sea ice now, and so that means the females are a bit less productive. We did just see a female with triplets on the cam the other day. Super exciting.
Oh, great.
Maybe the second time in 15 years or something like that I've seen, or whatever, 14 years that I've been up there that I've seen that event. So triplets are pretty rare now. So yeah, as bears have less food, they do have less cubs, and it's, of course, like we said, harder for them to survive.
And this is also a question specific to polar bears. Once a mother bear, goes to her den, will she pack snow around the entrance for warmth and protection, or does the snow just sort of consume her in a sense?
That's a really good question. That's the first time I've heard that question. What's interesting is, depending on where you are, polar bears have different dens. So the Churchill bears, the ones we see on the cams here, the females there could den in peat moss. Part of this is because there's no sea ice when it's time to go into the den. Late October, early November, late November, that time of year, sea ice isn't frozen yet. So best place to den would be actually in the peat. And then, yes, as she is in this peat den, the snow can drift and cover her over. Wouldn't guess that she actively goes out and kind of piles snow on herself. Just seeing how fast snow accumulates in Churchill, winds that are blowing today, snow can deposit incredibly fast. So I think she just kind of waits in the snow hole, and soon she's all closed up in there. Other bears around the world will den either on land in snow or out on the sea ice in snow caves. And in those situations, they do excavate the snow to dive in there. And those dens, I'm guessing it's the same, where the drifting winds, snow being drifted by winds, covers them over quite quickly.
And that's something that's similar with brown bears as well. Brown bears generally are really good at selecting den sites that collect a lot of snow, and that they don't push anything to the front of the den to help seal the den entrance. They just pick a site where it's likely to snow heavily and seal that off from the outside world. They just they seem to have an instinct for that even at a very very young age. So another
I
similarity
think what's
between these two species.
Yeah, I think what's really interesting, we don't have a ton of anecdotes about, individuals, but we have a few because of radio collars and other ways of identifying where individuals have been and things. But in Svalbard this last year, Polar Bears International works with the Norwegian Polar Institute and the San Diego Zoo to do some denning research. They're looking at what happens at polar bear dens when they come out, how many cubs they have, things like that. And we actually had a polar bear that denned only, I think it was about 10, 15, anyways, 20 meters or so away from the same spot she had denned the year before. And one of her siblings, I think it was one of her siblings, or possibly one of her daughters, had denned within 1 kilometer of where she
Wow.
did in the same year. So I think what's kind of interesting here is the landscapes are huge where these polar bears live, but do not be fooled. They seem to know exactly where they are. And think about this on top of that. Sure, if we go out for a walk, we can find our way home. Animals can do that. Your family dog can do that. But imagine if the streets were moving at a different rate of your house. This is the sea ice. The sea ice is floating. It can break apart, be blown around, and then come back in contact with land somewhere else. Somehow they still know where they are and can find their way around. I think it's amazing.
That is absolutely incredible. And speaking from experience, I do not have a sense of dead reckoning. I've been lost in the fog on top of mountains enough times. We don't need to get into the details of that right now. But yeah, that is when I think about how animals could do that, I'm just flabbergasted. It really is an amazing feat and ability that they have. One last question here, BJ. We'll try to get to this one quickly before the top of the hour. We talked a lot about polar bears. We talked a little bit about their food, especially seals. Love the Bears was wondering if there's less sea ice or no sea ice, could the seals then go to shore to have babies? Could that allow polar bears to have more feeding opportunities?
Boy, that is a super good question. I think polar bears are pretty hard to study as they are. They are in a super remote place. But as polar bear researchers, we are pretty lucky that they actually stay on the surface and they never go swimming below well, not never, but very rarely are they swimming below the surface. Seal researchers have an animal that come up for some air, like this one here. It basks in the sun for short periods of time, but spends a vast majority of its life in the water. I think we know a lot less about what's happening in the seal world as far as populations go, other than the fact that likely with less sea ice, ring seals need sea ice as well. This is how they give birth to their pups in the snow layers. If a seal were to give birth on the surface, it would the pup unable to go into the water would be susceptible to attacks from all types of predators, not just polar bears, but also the fox that live in the area, the birds that live in the area, all kinds of things. Not a pleasant story, but several years ago there was a rain event in Svalbard, and it melted away all of the seal pupping layers, leaving the pups exposed on the sea ice. And this is what happened. The fox and the birds and everything had free access to these animals. So, everybody up there needs the sea ice, from the little plankton to the little fish to the seals to the polar bears. We like to say that the sea ice is really like an upside down garden. When you look across the top of across the top of the sea ice, it looks fairly barren, but it's hosting the algae, which then the diatoms that you're seeing here feed on, which the copepods feed on, which the Arctic char feed on, which the ring seals feed on, and then the polar bears eat it. So really, without the sea ice, you don't have this ecosystem. You have another ecosystem, and the polar bear isn't at the top of that one. It's the killer whale.
Wow, yeah, that would be a considerable difference. In really a biome shift happening in the Arctic. We're witnessing it right now. BJ, it's been really great to speak with you today. I learned a lot about polar bears. I love working with the Polar Bears International staff. I'm looking forward to Polar Bear Week next week, and learning more about these amazing creatures.
Yeah, Mike, thanks so much. You had some great questions. I also learned a few things about the brown bear cousins, and it really is great to be in touch with you. Of course, if you guys recall, Mike was in Churchill with us a few years ago, and that was pretty fun to be able to share that space with you. Thanks for having us on here today, Mike. It's great to be connected with you.
Yeah, thank you so much. And if you want to learn more about polar bears, go to polarbearsinternational.org. A lot of tremendous resources on that website to learn more about these animals. I go there frequently when I have a polar bear question, and you can always watch the polar bear cams on explore.org/polar bears. Coming up next week is Polar Bear Week, but it's also the US election. And I would like to remind everybody that a vote for polar bears is also a vote for people. It is not a dichotomous choice. Climate change affects every one of us and will continue to do so at greater rates in the future. So please consider casting your vote at all levels of government for candidates who will act to mitigate climate change and transition our societies to a clean energy economy. And Katie, you can take it away with that video. But my name is Mike Fitz with explore.org. Thanks so much for joining me today, and we'll talk to you soon.
Right.
Future generations of people and polar bears depend on the decisions and plans that we make today. The key to getting the climate back to functioning the way it should, and to preserving a future for polar bears across the Arctic, is to move away from using fossil fuels for energy altogether. The most important thing we can do is vote with the climate in mind to let our leaders know we support a swift transition to renewable energy sources. In the meantime, we can directly participate in and learn more about our local and regional renewable energy options. We can all make a difference outside our own households by influencing where our energy comes from. We hope you leave here feeling inspired and return home to leverage your voice and your influence, because together we can make sure that polar bears roam the Arctic sea ice for generations to come.